Hello, everyone, and we are back with our next session. So, this session is all around the top 10 things that we have learned from the Mind Your Small Business podcast. So, absolutely delighted that we have Gordon Rutherford here today, who is the marketing director for AXA Business Insurance. And AXA have been sponsoring today's freelance zone stage. So, delighted that Gordon is going to be able to chat us through some of the lessons learned from the Mind Your Small Business podcast. So, I'll hand over to Gordon now. If you do have any questions throughout the session, please do feel free to put them into the chat. Myself and Helen will be keeping an eye out for those and jump on at the end to ask Gordon them. So over to you, Gordon.
Thank you, Nicola, and good afternoon, everyone. As Nicola said, I'm Gordon Rutherford from AXA, and I guess firstly you'll want to know what qualifies me to talk to you for the next 40 minutes or so about starting and running a business, and rightly so. After all, I have the luxury of working as marketing and CX director for a massive corporation, and on the 28th of each month I get paid a salary come what may. So, okay, before joining AXA 12 years ago, I was self-employed for a wee while, but so what? That hardly makes me an expert. Today, I might tap into some little fragments of that experience that I had, but only a little bit. Primarily, I'm going to share with you 10 things that we have learned from our Mind Your Small Business podcast. Now, I'm not so egotistical as to assume that you all know what Mind Your Small Business is, even though it's in Apple's top 65 UK podcasts, and that's of all topics, not just business. So let me give you the background. Mind Your Small Business is not our first foray into podcasting at AXA. We actually launched a kind of precursor a couple of years ago, a series called AXA's Mini Business Adventures, and it was pleasantly received. It was a great way for us to learn the ropes, but we knew we could do more, and we knew that we should do more. Because startups are an incredibly important sector for us at AXA. We genuinely want to be the brand who are associated with protecting new and fledgling businesses. And that's why we're a sponsor of this magnificent event. And that's why I'm here speaking today. It's why we do things like Mind Your Small Business and our Startup Angel initiative. Now, I'm not here to plug that, but if there's anyone out there who's seriously thinking of starting a business in 2022, you really need to check that out. The purpose of Mind Your Small Business is to be something that's really useful to people who are thinking of starting a business or who have recently started one. It's a resource, a toolbox almost. And don't be put off by the fact that it comes from AXA, because we never, ever talk about insurance on it, so don't worry. Season 1, which ended in October, was made up of 11 episodes, each one focused on a specific topic. Things like side hustles, planning and organising, getting online, and the dreaded taxation. A real variety, and there was so much more going on. And every week, we had 2 or 3 guests on, experts in their field, not like me, people who run their own small business, who deal with the challenging reality of that every single day. People at the sharp end who are expertly qualified to talk about things that I'm going to talk about today. They talk about the things that kept them awake at night, and they spoke about what gave them greatest pleasure from being self-employed. And most of them were AXA customers, which is also great. We had some fantastic people on the series, like Faris Aranki of Shiageto Consulting. Faris was so good that he now features in our current advertising campaign. Seriously. We also had Matt Roberts, who very recently founded the cybersecurity training company ArcX. And we had China Mason, who founded That Doodle Girl. China actually started up during lockdown version 1, when everyone was at their most worried and most fearful. China saw an opportunity to make people smile through that, and her story is incredibly inspirational. And it wasn't only small business owners. We had some real heavy hitters as guests in the podcast too, people who started tiny and grew into something very big. People like Holly Tucker from Not in the High Street, and the Bosch founders, Ian Thiesby and Henry Firth. We had Raphael Sofaluk, founder of the UK Black Business Show. What a great mix. People at the very top of the profession, but also a number of people who are starting out. So the pearls of wisdom that I'm going to share with you today, the top 10, comes from the mouths of all these great people, not from me. And these top 10 things recurred so frequently throughout the season that we thought they were worth sharing. So without further ado, let me go to number 1. A website is essential. Now, I kicked off the session in my introduction by saying that I wasn't going to talk about my experience. So let me begin by talking about something that happened to me. It's something very topical. It's something that's happened in the last week, and it really reinforced this principle that a website is essential. Around about a week ago, I discovered that I had a slow puncture in my car. So I went to the garage, put the air in, drove home, drove for a couple of days, and then found that the tyre was getting soft again. So I decided that rather than going to one of the big chains, I would get one of these mobile tyre fitters to come and do it, kind of in the comfort of my own driveway, at a time that suits me. I didn't have to go to them and all that kind of stuff. Great. Wanted to use a local business because I try to use local businesses as much as possible. So went to where we all go, went to Google and searched on mobile tyre fitters in my area and got a healthy result back. A number of tyre companies were there, all offering to do it, but none of them had a website. And I found that really challenging because I had no idea how much the tyre would be. I had no idea what brand it would be. I had no idea if they could do the right size. I had no idea what date it was going to be booked in for. And I ended up booking it in for tomorrow morning with a national. And I really, really didn't want to do that. But it emphasised to me why a website is so important to every kind of business in this day and age. I suspect that more white-collar workers than blue-collar workers have a website. It tends to be the kind of thing if you're setting up a consultancy, for example, you would set up a couple of web pages to look credible. But actually, when you think about it, people like mobile tyre fitters or landscape gardeners or builders, a website should be the perfect vehicle for them to showcase their work because it's quite visible. You know, if you think what a landscape gardener could do with a website, you know, they could really convince people to use their services. In episode 4 of Mind Your Small Business, the men-dip chocolate chef, Louise Sturmey, spoke eloquently about her experience, about having a website made her feel that her business had gravitas and a presence. It felt like a real business. And Louise spoke about how beneficial it is that she could take orders online from customers rather than depending upon footfall. In episode 5, David J. Tovey of Montees also touched upon the importance of having a website. When the pandemic hit, David would have sunk without a website. And speaking of David, let's go to number 2, Know Your Customer. David was such a brilliant guest. We could have done a 3-hour feature-length podcast and he would have kept you engaged throughout that whole time with his stories. Now, this part is entitled Know Your Customer. It's hardly a top tip, really. I mean, it's the lifeblood of any business. It's obvious businesses depend upon customers. But when David was speaking about this, he was speaking about it from a marketing perspective. And in his early years, he fell into that trap that everyone falls into of being too scared to fish in a small pond. And what people tend to do is they don't want to restrict their market. They want to appeal to a market of 55 million people rather than 500,000. So they spray and pray. They do scattergun marketing, hoping that some of it sticks. And David found that his marketing only started to work when he really understood his customer and focused on where and how to reach them. So David's business is a tea business, but it's not like Thai Fu or Yorkshire teas. It's niche. It's very bespoke. It specialises in loose leaf tea and tea paraphernalia. So it is a niche business. Yeah. Things turned for him the minute he realised the people who were buying tea from him were slightly different from those who went to Tesco to buy tea bags. By doing this, by understanding his customer base better, by understanding how to target them and where to target them, he minimised waste. All of his marketing budget was being spent much more efficiently, purely through understanding his customer. And there's another example that David gave in that episode that I really loved about understanding customers and listening to customers and taking cognizance of their feedback. David got a couple of pieces of feedback in quick succession from people around plastic-free packaging. Now, immediately he paid attention to this. He recognised that this was becoming a talked about and important factor in terms of people choosing which suppliers and which businesses they wanted to deal with. So he adapted quickly. He changed. What he did was he scrapped all of his old packaging and went completely plastic free. Now, that would have been fine in itself, but what he also did was he made a point of promoting that aspect. He knew that was important to his customer base, and it started to get picked up by Facebook plastic-free groups and things like that. So Facebook were doing his promotion for him. And what happened with David in a short space of time was that his online sales went from 4% of his turnover to 17%, and his turnover grew exponentially as well. One of the other lovely things that David did, knowing how kind of quirky his customers were, was he had a chocolate teapot manufactured and put in the shop window of his shop. And again, it was picked up by a local newspaper. It was picked up by people who are local to the shop, and word of mouth spread, and the newspaper article spread, and people started to come from far and wide to see the chocolate teapot. And guess what? They also shopped in his shop. So some lovely stories there about knowing your customer. Tip 3 is don't give away your time for free. In episode 1 of Mind Your Small Business, one of our guests was Amber Craddock of Amber's Car Care. Amber is absolutely passionate about cars. And by the way, one of the common threads that we found with all of our guests on Mind Your Small Business was their passion for their business. The vast majority of people now who are self-employed, who are out there running small businesses, people like Amber and people like China, who I mentioned earlier on, are doing what they do because they love it. They have a passion for it. That makes it pretty easy to get up in the morning when you really, really care for and love what you do. Amber has a passion for cars, so much so that she gave up a career as a teacher to go off and train as a mechanic. And what she does now is run a car care business, her own car care business. One of the things it specialises in is specialist cleaning and washing and valeting of cars. And her passion to make every single car look as good as it possibly can and function as good as it possibly can led to her putting in a lot of extra hours on each customer's car, doing stuff that they hadn't asked for, basically giving away her time for free. And a job that should have lasted 1 hour was taking Amber 2 or 3 hours. She very quickly learned that that was inefficient. She was basically giving up her time. She also learned that she could turn her passion into an advantage and turn the situation on its head. So what she did was she used her passion for cars to upsell the services to those customers who were previously buying things that would take maybe 20 minutes or 30 minutes, and upselling them and creating more revenue but still spending the same amount of time on the car. In relation to that, a really common theme amongst people who are self-employed and at the early stages of self-employment is giving away admin time for free, which leads us very nicely to the next tip. It's more than the job. So I've spoken a couple of times about China. One of the things in China in episode 2, that China mentioned was that she was charging people for the work that she did. Now, what China does is she draws on people's windows, basically. She creates, transforms windows into works of art. And what she was doing was she was charging them for turning up and painting on the window. What she wasn't charging them for was the time it took to come out and scope the job, the paint itself, the preparation, the planning, all of that kind of stuff. And that is a common thing for people when they start out. They're kind of reluctant in the early stages to ask a client for money for preparation time. Consultancy, it's very common in that world when people are starting out. The first question you get asked by a prospective client is, what's your day rate? And typically you'll pitch it low because you want to get the business. And the last thing you will do is factor in the 1 week's preparation time that goes into preparing for that 2-day event you're going to run. You can't do that. You won't survive for long if you do that. Yeah. So when we talk about it being more than the job, it's more than the actual time on site itself that you should be billing for. Another thing to remember about being self-employed is that you always have to go into it with your eyes open. Being self-employed is not a 9-to-5. And China spoke about the work that she had to put in preparation for each job. And we were talking hours in some cases, driving maybe 40 or 50 miles to look at a site to figure out what she could do with it. So not only do you have to figure out how to cost these things and charge for them, psychologically, you have to think about it as well. Because if you are used to a 9-to-5 suits you, then you might have to think again about self-employment, because typically you are working 7 days a week at the strangest possible hours. Slide 5. No plan survives first contact. This is an old military saying I discovered. It comes from the 19th century. It comes from a Prussian field marshal whose name was Helmut von Moltke. And this was quoted by one of our guests in episode 3. Matt Roberts, who I spoke about earlier, who runs ArcX, is an ex-military guy. So he's accustomed to this. And actually in episode 3 of the Mind Your Small Business series, the topic that day was planning and organising. And we spent about 20 minutes, 25 minutes talking through all of the really important and critical planning and organising techniques. How to plan your day well, how to plan your diary, how to organise activities, when to do admin, when to speak to clients, doing all that kind of stuff. And everybody on that episode agreed that planning and organising was absolutely critical for any small business. And then about 22 minutes into the podcast, Matt said the most important thing he's learned in his life actually is that no plan survives first contact. And his point was, you can plan and organise as much as you like, but at some point something will happen and you have to be ready to flex. You have to be flexible, you have to be adaptable, and agility is absolutely key. And if you think back to March 2020, when the world changed, big companies like AXA weren't ready for what happened. Suddenly we had to get tens of thousands of people at home, no longer in offices. That's a big undertaking. And for a small business, we spoke earlier about David Tovey and Montees and how the fact that he had a website meant that he could adapt from being a high street tea purveyor to an online one immediately. No plan survives first contact. You always have to have something up your sleeve in case things change dramatically, because, you know, as sure as eggs are eggs, they will. Number 6, remember the tax man. Dominic Livingston of D24 spoke about this at length in episode 8, and he spoke really well about it because Dominic's not a tax guy, but we wanted to get him on the podcast to understand what somebody who is not a tax person, who's not financially savvy, and to understand how they dealt with financial matters like taxation, which, let's face it, is one of the top 2 or 3 things that keep self-employed people awake overnight. And the one thing that Dominic stressed is preparation. When you first become self-employed, you bill people, you invoice people, and you get cash. Yeah, money comes in. You might have a small shop, it might be an online shop, you might have a window cleaning business. Anyway, money will come in, and you suddenly think, that's wonderful, I'm making cash. Everything is rosy in the garden. It's fantastic. And the cash accumulates, and you make a little bit more cash, and you pay some bills, and you've still got some cash, and this is great. And suddenly you think, wow, wouldn't it be good to have a holiday? So you take yourself off to Marbella for 2 weeks in the sun, and everything's hunky-dory, and then you remember you have to do something called a tax return. And you do your tax return, and it tells you that you have to pay £5,000 in tax, and you realise you haven't put any money aside for that eventuality. So Dominic's thing, and he didn't elaborate, I don't know if he was talking from experience, he didn't elaborate, but Dominic's thing was, for goodness sake, don't spend all of your revenue, because at some point the inland revenue will come along and demand some of that. And the other really important point that Dominic made, it's kind of reminiscent of the famous quote in The Godfather: keep your friends close, but your receipts and invoices closer. You will save yourself an inordinate length of time and pain and effort if you spend a few minutes each day organising your receipts and invoices. There is nothing more frustrating or stressful or time-consuming and leaving it for 364 days and your tax return is due in at midnight on the morning you wake up and you suddenly decide to start to pull together your receipts and invoices to do your tax return. That way madness lies. Don't do that. Be prepared. Keep your invoices and your receipts to hand. Log them, register them, and, you know, be planned, be prepared. The other thing about taxation and self-employment, and you speak to lots of people about this, is when do you register for VAT, for VAT? Now, legally, you are required to register for VAT if your taxable turnover exceeds £85,000. Yeah, if it's under that, you do not have to be VAT registered. So you're not legally obliged to do that. The decision comes, I guess, depending upon the field you're in, around whether to do it for credibility purposes. So let me tell you what I mean by that. When I was self-employed, I was VAT registered before I hit the threshold, long before I hit the threshold. And the reason for that was, if I was dealing with big clients, corporate clients, I wanted them to think that I was credible and that I was a bigger business than what I was. And by doing that, by putting a VAT number on the invoice, I believed it gave that impression. Now, I'm much older and wiser now, and I've actually spoken to lots of people about this, and it doesn't make that much difference. the one thing it does bring when you become VAT registered is quarterly VAT returns, which are stressful, they are painful, and they are time consuming. So weigh up the benefits of being VAT registered or not very carefully. The one final thing I would say about HMRC is everyone has this kind of really scary perception, but it's only fair that I tell you my dealings with the taxman have always been very professional and very helpful and very friendly. And, you know, I think they probably get a bad rep, like so many bodies like that, but I've always found them to be decent. So there we are. Number 7, tip 7, you can't do everything. It's very easy when you work for a big company because you're surrounded by subject matter experts. You've got an IT director and a finance director. You've got a marketing director. You've got legal people. You've got an HR director. You know, you've got people on tap who know all this stuff. Yeah. And then suddenly you become self-employed and you're the IT director and you're the marketing director and you're the finance director and you're forced to do everything and you cannot do everything. It is impossible. In episode 6, Faris Aranki, who I mentioned is now in our adverts, he spoke about this. He spoke about it really eloquently, and he stressed that you absolutely can't do everything. And one of the things that he said, one of the examples that he gave was just before he appointed an accountant to look after his finances, he actually had an epiphany where he sat down and said, I'm sorry, I can't spend 10 hours of my month, working on the books for this business anymore. I need an accountant. And these are things that you're going to have to accept. What puts a lot of small businesses off is the cost. Everyone assumes I don't have the cash flow to cope with that. I can't afford it. I can't afford to hire an accountant. I can't afford to pay somebody to build a website. But there's a couple of things that you have to factor in. Firstly, let's deal with the website thing. When I was self-employed, I set up my own website. This was in 2005. I think it took me a month. And when I was finished, it was still crap. Yeah. I would have been better paying somebody a couple of £100 30 days earlier to do it for me, because it would have been better. And over the course of that month, I could have done stuff that was much more productive and revenue generating. So one of the things you always have to think about is, if you want to do everything, if you want to do your own tax, if you want to build your own website, if you want to do all that kind of stuff, then what is the opportunity cost of that? What are you missing out on? Because you're self-employed to sell what you are good at. You're not self-employed to do stuff that you can't really do, but you're going to have a little stab at it. The other thing you have to factor in is the risk. Now, I know a lot of self-employed people in the early stages who do their own tax. I did my own VAT returns. Fortunately, touch wood, nothing went wrong. But what if it did? I wasn't an expert. The penalties for getting something like that wrong are absolutely drastic. You look at somebody who's selling something online, maybe creating a small shop to do stuff online, who's maybe collecting customer data and payment data. If you get something like that wrong with GDPR legislation, my goodness, you'll know all about it. You won't be trading for much longer. So you have to factor up two things, the opportunity cost and the risk. And you have to accept that you can't do everything. Number 8 is don't panic. And I thought this was a really good tip that we got throughout the series. In episode 1 of Mind Your Small Business, Holly Tucker talks openly about the near misses that she had when she was setting up Not in the High Street. They very, very, very nearly didn't make it on more than one occasion. On a few occasions, they nearly didn't make it. They didn't panic. They just kept at it. They changed tack slightly. They adapted and they kept going. In episode 7, Simon Gallagher from RDAM Consultancy spoke eloquently about this as well. And he spoke about the whole concept of feast and famine, and self-employment is like that. And this came out in several conversations throughout the series, the feast and famine thing. When you have times of famine and the money is not rolling in, use the time constructively. Go back to your networks. Look again at your social media presence and think about refreshing it. Think about rewriting a blog or refreshing your website or doing something like that. Use the time productively. Don't panic, because panicking will get you nowhere. There will be other times when the cash rolls in. Yeah. And this was a common theme from the podcast series as well. There will be times, moments in time, not very often, I hasten to add, but it will happen. There will be moments in time when you feel like Jeff Bezos. It's similar to the conversation about tax. Stash it away. When the money's rolling in, stash it away. Typically, when you work for an organisation, you get paid the same amount every month. When I was self-employed, I never earned the same amount 2 months in a row. Some months you would earn double what you would earn as an employee. Some months you will earn nothing. And that happened with me. And when that happens, when you earn nothing, if you've been banking the money when you are in the feast period, then it won't be a problem. Yep. Again, it's about forward planning and thinking ahead. The feast rarely lasts forever, by the way. But the good news is the famine rarely lasts forever either. So don't panic. And the other thing, the other typical, a very common thing that came out in the podcast series that so many of our guests spoke about was the importance of having a network of people who you trust that you can speak to. Rather than panicking and fretting and sitting at home worrying about it and having sleepless nights, have a couple of people you can go out and have a cup of coffee with and talk to and say openly, non-judgmentally, look, I'm having a difficult time just now. The money's not rolling in the way it was 12 months ago. I'm finding it difficult to get new clients. And you know, even talking about it helps. So don't panic. Self-belief and confidence goes a long way. That was a really, really, really common theme from Mind Your Small Business. Lauren Livingston from Live Creative in episode 10 speaks about this, and she told a lovely story. And she spoke about how when she was in the throes of starting up, she wasn't really sure if she was really going to do this or not. And she talked about the first time she pitched for business, and she builds websites, and a potential client contacted her and asked her to kind of send over some stuff to show the client what the website might look like and how it might work and what have you. And Lauren spent some time into preparing this and building it out and sent it to the client and didn't hear anything. And in that interim period where she's waiting for the client to come back, she's thinking, I should have spent more time to prepare this. I should have done this. I should have paid more attention to the presentation. I should have worded the email differently. I should have costed it differently. And all these doubts were going through her mind. And the client eventually responded. And I say eventually, it didn't actually take that long. And she saw the mail coming in, the email coming in, because she was waiting for it. She saw it pop up in the window. And she opened it, and there was just 3 words there. And the client said, I love it. And that feeling, that is such an amazing feeling. And Lauren spoke about that. And it was a really special moment. And you know, the feeling that you get from that, that's what fuels self-belief. And that was the moment when she knew she could make a go of this. That was the moment that gave her the confidence to take the next step and do this seriously, full-time, professionally. And that's something that she always goes back to. She always reflects on that and thinks, wait a minute, I am really good at this. Remember that when I was just starting out and that happened? I know what I'm doing. I'm really good at this. It's all about self-belief. Once upon a time, I was lucky to work for a chief exec who as a very, very, very special leader. In fact, she was recognised last month in the Forbes top 100 women list. And she was actually above Beyonce and the Queen. And people have this perception of this leader, that she's a certain type of person. And she's very charismatic and what have you. But I remember speaking to her once at a dinner and I was sitting next to her. And she told me how she suffers dreadfully at times from imposter syndrome. And that was a really common theme, again, from the podcast series. The number of people who say, actually, I'm not sure I'm qualified to be doing what I'm doing. That affects even the greatest of leaders and the most skilled, seemingly most confident people. And imposter syndrome affects almost everybody. Everyone will suffer from it. But you know what? Try to be like Lauren. Try to remember those moments when somebody said to you, I love it. I love what you do. What you're doing special. And that should give you the confidence and the self-belief to say, no, wait a minute. I do know what I'm doing. I am good at this. And I do have license to sell my product or service. And that leads me to the final point, to be the cheerleader of your own dreams. I love this quote. The world is a really cruel place at times. We all know that. And being self-employed can be incredibly lonely. People are always quick to jump on your ideas and give you advice. And it's usually from their perspective and according to their agenda. And this is when self-belief and confidence become really important. But more than anything, it's when resilience kicks in. And I spoke previously about Holly Tucker and how Not on the High Street came very, very close on more than one occasion to not making it. I bet you there were people around about Holly, family members and friends, who were saying, do you know what, Holly? This isn't for you. Go back to the day job. Your company will take you back. You'll get a day job. You're really good at doing that other thing. Go back to do that. But she didn't. She was the cheerleader of her own dreams. No matter what people told her, she thought, no, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be resilient. I'm going to be strong. I'm going to work my way through this. I'm not going to panic. Yep. I'm not a self-help guru. And personally, I'm not a big fan of self-help gurus. I believe that self-help comes from within. And that really is what being the cheerleader of your own dreams is all about. It is about understanding, what makes you tick and finding the inspiration from within to keep going throughout that. And again, I keep talking about common themes from the podcast, irrespective of the episode, whether we were talking about taxation or planning or organising or anything like that. You can always draw comments and quotes from each episode where people have demonstrated evidence that they've had to be resilient and be the cheerleader of their dreams. So that concludes the top 10. I didn't choose them. They're the top 10 things that did come out of the series. So if they didn't work for you, then I'm really sorry, but it's what everybody else was talking about at the time. I am now more than happy to take any questions that anyone has on any of that, if anyone wants to have a conversation about it at all. Thank you very much for listening.
Gordon, can you hear Nicola all right?
I can't hear Nicola, no.
I think, are you on mute now, Nicola?
That would have been helpful.
I was just checking whether it was me or not.
Brilliant, thank you. Sorry about that, everyone. I've been busy telling people to come off mute all day, and now I'm doing it. All I was saying is thanks a million, Gordon, for that. There was a lot covered in that short session, but fantastic. Yeah, I see some comments in the chat here now saying we can't hear you, so hopefully you can now. someone has also said they love that quote about the receipts. So there's a few things picked up on that. But I suppose for me, what I really liked is that important reminder about imposter syndrome, because it is something that's talked about all the time. And you do hear entrepreneurs chat about it and different people chat about it, but it's even those people that are running really successful businesses that are facing the same sort of maybe insecurities or self-belief that everyone faces. So that's really, really interesting. Yeah, a few comments there just saying about excellent talk. Thank you so much. So, I mean, in terms of for you, Gordon, you mentioned these were the key themes that were picked up from the podcast. If there was maybe one thing, I know there was 10, but if there was one bit of advice that you would give to these small business owners that are listening today, the freelancers, what would it be? I know it's sometimes hard to pick one.
I think the psychology of running a small business broadly was the biggest thing. I think when you look at things like taxation and planning and organising and how to use social media and what have you, I think these are all skills that you can learn or lean on people. But I think the stuff that's within you is absolutely critical. Nobody else can do that. That's the one thing you can't outsource. You can't outsource self-belief. You can't outsource being the cheerleader of your own dream. You have to be able to believe in yourself and do that and have a lot of confidence in yourself. And the thing about imposter syndrome is really, really, really is massive. And everybody talks about this, throughout the series. It is how you deal with that. You have to be able to deal with that. You have to understand where it's happening. And you have to have like tools and techniques that allow you to kind of turn things around and say, well, actually, no, I do know what I'm doing and I know how to cope with this. I would say that kind of stuff, the psychology, is more important than the actual practical stuff.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks a million, Gordon. And yes, thanks a million for taking the time out today to share those learnings from the podcast. I don't know if I was saying this when I was on mute or if I actually did say it, but if you haven't already, now might be a good time just to give some of those episodes a listen. But thanks again to Gordon. As I said, AXA Business Insurance have been sponsoring the Freelance on Stage today. So thank you very much for them for doing that. If you want to find out a wee bit more about AXA Business Insurance, we do have a booth in the exhibition area alongside other sponsors. So please feel free to check them out there. So yeah, we'll finish up with this session now and we'll go backstage and get set up for our next discussion, which is all around how to manage a successful freelance business. So it's a bit more of a panel discussion. But thank you, Gordon. And I'm sure if we I'm sure people want to reach out, they can.
Yeah, thank you.
All the best.